Welcome to 3:15 o'clock, that very channel where the unspoken becomes unforgettable. Do you have the courage to explore the stories they always wanted to hide from you? This is not just a horror channel. This is a place where silence is shattered by secrets, and every story carries a weight of fear it was never meant to bear. The first story. The path without beginning. It all started with a dusty folio Ray found at a flea market. Untrodden paths of the New World. Read the faded gold lettering on the leather binding. Most chapters were devoted to mundane tourist routes, but one, the shortest and riddled with pencil marks, told of the Path of Tears. Legend had it that it led to a waterfall that didn't just cascade water, but wept the earth's bloody tears. A liquid ruby that solidified in the sunset rays into bizarre gems. For Ree, an avid adventurer, this was the holy grail. Her friend Chloe was a pragmatist to the core. She preferred comfortable hikes with pop-up tents and GPS navigators, but Ray's charm and passion were infectious. Eventually, Chloe relented, setting only one condition. Just for a week, no more. Now, standing in the thick of a forest that seemed to defy the laws of physics, Chloe bitterly regretted her acquiescence. They had turned off the main, well-kept trail 6 hours ago, guided by a faint symbol carved on a root-bound boulder, 3 nested semicircles, resembling distorted pupils. The air, initially fresh and filled with the scent of pine, had become thick and stifling, with a hint of sweetish decay. The sunlight, which had recently danced on the leaves, now broke through in meager, faded rays, even though by all accounts it should have been streaming down in full force. The trees closed above them in a living vault, their branches, black and gnarled like the bones of giant birds, weaving into an impenetrable canopy. The silence was unnatural, absolute, as if someone had muted the entire world. Ray. Chloe's voice sounded unnaturally loud in the oppressive silence. We've been walking for 5 hours. By my calculations, we should have either reached the waterfall or returned to the start of the trail. Ray, walking ahead, turned around. Her face, usually lit with an adventurous smile, was serious. I know, but the path is here. We're following it. What path? Chloe pointed irritably at the ground. The trail they had been following, a narrow but clear strip of packed earth, had simply vanished. They were standing on a carpet of rotten leaves and moss, identical in all directions. Panic, cold and clammy, rose in Chloe's throat. She snatched the compass from her belt, an antique bronze family heirloom she brought for luck. The needle, instead of settling down, spun wildly like a crazed wasp. It darted in circles, paused for a second, and began its insane dance again. Ray, look at this, Chloe whispered. Ray came closer. Their shoulders touched, and the contact made things slightly less terrifying. They silently watched the twitching needle, and suddenly it stopped dead, but it wasn't pointing north. It trembled, aimed straight down, into the thickness of the dark, almost black earth beneath their feet. The slight tremor Chloe had felt before turned into full-scale shaking. That's impossible. A magnetic anomaly. It must be. Let's go back, Ray said shortly, and her voice held a note of uncertainty for the first time. She turned and stepped confidently in the direction from which she thought they had come. Chloe, not letting go of the mad compass, followed her. They walked for 10 minutes, 20, half an hour. The forest around them didn't change. The same gnarled trunks, the same moss, the same dead silence. And then Chloe noticed. Ray, stop. On the trunk of an old oak, right in front of them, was carved that same symbol. The 3 nested semicircles, the distorted pupil. We've been here already, Chloe said, and her voice broke into a whisper. It can't be. Ray ran to the tree, ran her fingers over the rough bark. It's a different tree, just a marker. She led them forward again, quickening her pace. Chloe followed silently, desperately trying to suppress the inner voice screaming that they were walking in circles. 15 minutes later, they came back to the same oak. This time Ray said nothing. Her face was white. They tried going in the opposite direction, then at a right angle. The result was always the same. After a while, they stumbled upon a tree with that same mark. It wasn't just a loop, it was a trap. Space had closed around them like a fist. They stood back to back, peering into the greenish twilight advancing from the thicket. The sun, which had been hanging directly overhead all this time, defying all laws of time, finally began to set in the west, casting long, ugly shadows. It was at that moment the silence was broken. At first it was a barely perceptible sound. Not the wind, there was no wind here at all. It was a quiet, dry rustle, the rustle that autumn leaves make when they are dragged slowly and methodically across the ground. But there was weight to it. There was intention. Ray slowly turned her head. "Do you hear that?" Chloe just nodded, clenching her fists so hard her nails dug into her palms. The rustle didn't come from one point. It came from the right, then from the left, then from behind. Slow, measured, relentless. Someone or something was approaching them from all sides, dragging something heavy and rustling along the forest floor. "Who's there?" Ray shouted. Her voice was loud and defiant, but Chloe detected genuine animal fear in it. In response, the rustle only intensified. It grew closer. Now, individual sounds could be discerned within it. The crunch of a twig, the soft squelch of wet clay, that very same vial, dry scraping of dragged leaves. Chloe, fighting paralysis, rushed to the nearest tree, trying to climb it, to find some vantage point. The bark was slippery and wet like sloughing skin. She fell, scraping her knee, and then she saw them. In the gaps between the trees, silhouettes flickered. They were humanoid, but too tall and thin, their limbs bending unnaturally like a spider's. They didn't walk. They glided, their legs hidden by a swirling cloud of leaves and earth that they dragged behind them, creating that very rustle. Their bodies seemed molded from mud, roots, and shadows. They had no faces. Where faces should have been, there were only smooth, convex surfaces, upon which, glowing with a dull light, were burned those same 3 semicircles, distorted pupils. They moved silently apart from that horrifying rustle and surrounded them, slowly tightening the ring. "Ray!" Chloe screamed, scrambling backward and bumping into her friend. Ray stood rooted to the spot, staring at the approaching figures with disgust and a strange, almost religious horror. "The path of tears," she whispered. "It doesn't lead to a waterfall. It is the waterfall. A waterfall of us." The creatures were now 20 meters away. Now not only the rustle was audible, a quiet, stuttering susurration could be heard, like a muttering composed of the whisper of leaves and the creaking of old trees. It sounded like mockery, like an invitation. One of the creatures, the closest, slowly raised its long, root-like arm. It wasn't pointing at them. It was pointing down, to the same place the compass needle had pointed. Chloe looked down at her feet. The ground where the creature pointed seemed darker, almost black, and it was breathing. A faint, barely perceptible stream of air came from it, cold as a grave, smelling of damp earth and ancient decay. "It's guiding us," Chloe realized in horror. Ray finally snapped out of her stupor. "No, no!" She grabbed Chloe's hand and lunged in the only available direction, a gap between 2 approaching shadows. The rustle instantly changed. From slow and threatening, it became sharp, furious, full of hissing malice. The creatures rushed after them. Their gliding movement proved deceptively fast. The girls ran, not choosing their path, stumbling over roots, lashing their faces with branches. The rustle pursued them, no longer from the sides, but directly from behind. Chloe risked a glance back. One of the creatures was just a few steps away. Its face with the glowing semicircles was now right in front of her. She saw that it wasn't just a symbol. They were real eyes, composed of layers of tree rings nested within each other, and in their center pulsed a black, pitch-black void. The creature reached out its hand. It wasn't made of flesh, but of intertwined roots and sticky mud. It reached not for Chloe herself, but for her legs, for the ground beneath her. And at that moment, Ray stumbled and fell with a cry into a thicket of ferns. Chloe tried to pull her up, but the soil under Ray's feet suddenly shifted, squirmed, turning into slurry. Thin, tentacle-like roots sprouted from it and wrapped around Ray's legs, pulling her down. "Chloe," she screamed, and in her eyes was not just fear, but complete, absolute understanding. "The path. It feeds." Chloe desperately pulled at her hands, but she was immobile, as if welded to the ground. The rustle loomed over them, drowning out everything. The other creatures had now approached, forming a circle. They didn't attack. They observed. Their faceless faces were turned towards the event, with cold, indifferent curiosity. Ray continued to sink. The earth was already up to her waist. She stopped screaming. She looked at Chloe, and in her gaze was an inexpressible pity. "Run," her lips whispered, but there was nowhere to run. The circle was closed, and then Chloe felt the soil under her own feet becoming soft, pliable. The cold tentacles of roots were already coiling around her ankles. She looked down. The dark earth was slowly sucking her in like quicksand. The rustle around grew quieter but did not cease. Now it sounded like a lullaby, like a soothing chorus of 1,000 voices. The last thing Chloe saw before the darkness consumed her completely was Ray's face, disappearing under the black, breathing earth. And somewhere on the edge of consciousness, she thought she heard a new sound superimposed on the eternal rustle. A quiet, measured knocking, as if deep underground, in the very essence of this cursed path. A giant pendulum was swinging, counting down the time until the next lost traveler. And above the forest, finally, a fake, doll-like moon slowly crept toward the horizon, casting long, motionless shadows on the ground from trees on whose trunks the same 3 semicircles appeared, one after another, distorted pupils, looking nowhere and everywhere at once. The path, without beginning, awaited its next victim to continue its eternal, meaningless circle. The second story. The Keeper's Cottage. The mountain seemed to hate them from the very first minute. First, it greeted them with a furious sun that scorched away their sweat and strength, then with treacherous scree that slid out from under their feet as if unwilling to hold them. And then, when they reached the old abandoned serpentine road, the sky, which had been piercingly blue moments ago, turned black in a matter of seconds. A cold wind smelling of ozone and wet stone rushed down from the pass, and the downpour began. It wasn't rain, but a solid wall of water crashing down on them with such force it stole their breath. Sam and Dean, brothers bound not only by blood, but by a passion for extreme hiking, were soaked through in an instant. "To hell with everything," Dean shouted, barely audible over the roar of the rain. "We need shelter." There was nowhere to run. Rocks, a few rare wind-twisted pines, and nothing more. They were already preparing to press their backs against the cold stone and wait out this madness when Sam, wiping his water-blurred eyes, pointed ahead. "Look!" In a break in the grey curtain of rain off to the side of the path stood a cottage. Tiny, built from dark, almost black timber, it seemed to have grown into the mountainside. It was so inconspicuous it could have been mistaken for a pile of stones, if not for the square of its single window, dark and sightless. They ran towards it, stumbling over wet roots. Above the low door hung a wooden sign, half eroded by time and weather. The letters, once burned into the wood, were hard to read. "Keeper. Do not enter. Hospitable." Dean snorted, already grabbing the iron bracket that served as a handle. "Wait." Sam put a hand on his shoulder. "It says do not enter." "Out there," Dean retorted. "It says drown or freeze." He shoved the door hard. It gave way with a creak, opening into darkness and cold. The air inside was stale, smelling of dust, dry rot, and something else. A faint but persistent scent of old leather and bygone years. The rain outside immediately became muffled, as if someone had turned down the volume. They found themselves in a single room. No furniture, no hearth. Bare walls roughly cobbled together from the same dark logs. In one corner lay a pile of debris that might once have been a bed. In the opposite corner, Sam noticed an object that stood out against the absolute desolation. It was a book, thick, in a worn leather binding, without any identifying marks. It lay neatly, as if placed there only yesterday. "The logbook," Sam uttered, picking it up. The leather cover felt cold and rough to the touch. "The keepers." Dean, meanwhile, approached the single window. The glass was murky, covered on the inside with a layer of age-old grime. "Strange," he muttered. "The rain seems to have stopped." Sam looked up from the book. "It can't be. We were being washed away 5 minutes ago." "See for yourself." Sam joined his brother. Outside the window there wasn't a drop of rain. Only a thick, milky white, utterly motionless fog. It lay like a dense blanket, obscuring everything more than a couple of meters from the wall. No rocks or trees were visible. It seemed the cottage was floating alone in airless space, cut off from the entire world. That was fast, Sam said uncertainly. A feeling of mild anxiety, previously muted by the relief of escape from the downpour, began to stir in his chest. Mountain whims. Dean brushed it off, but the former confidence was gone from his voice too. "What's in the book?" Sam returned to the center of the room, crouched down and opened the heavy cover. The pages were yellowed, the ink faded, but the handwriting in most entries was firm and neat. It was a dry report on the weather, wildlife spotted, the condition of some trail. Sam leafed through until he reached the final pages. Here the handwriting began to change. First it became uneven, then hurried. And the last entry, the one that took up a whole page, was written in a trembling, broken hand. The letters jumped, the ink blots resembling tear stains or splashes of something else. "They are not on the trail," Sam read aloud, and his voice sounded deafeningly loud in the tomb-like silence. "They were never on the trail. They are inside. They seep through the cracks. They are in the very air. They know my scent. They feel my breath. They whisper outside the walls, but the walls are them. I am no longer the keeper. I am prey, in a cage. I must go out. I must go out now before—" The entry broke off mid-sentence. No signature, no date, only a yawning emptiness below, filled with the pen's trembling flourishes that never formed into letters. Sam raised his eyes to Dean. He stood in the middle of the room, pale, listening to the silence. The silence outside was now absolute. No wind, no sound of water, nothing. Ravings of a mad hermit. Dean tried to break the tension with a joke, but his smile was crooked and unnatural, just a lunatic's notes. At that moment they heard the sound. It was quiet but distinct, seeming to come from the very walls. Not a creak or a rustle. It was a scraping, the sound made when something sharp and heavy, perhaps a piece of iron or a sharpened stone, is dragged across rough, unplaned wood. Scree! They froze, holding their breath. The sound repeated. Scree! Slow, measured, intentional, and then they realized the most terrible thing. It didn't come from one point. One scraping came from the wall with the door. A second, almost in sync with it, came from the wall with the window. From two opposite sides simultaneously. Someone or something was outside, and it wasn't alone. Dean lunged for the door, grabbed the iron bracket. It wouldn't budge, as if jammed. He threw his whole weight against it, but the door, which had opened so easily from the outside, was now immovable as rock. Damn it, he cursed, jumping back. The scraping continued. Scree, Scree, it grew slightly louder. Now within it, one could discern not just friction, but what seemed like an attempt to bite into the wood, to tear off its top layer. "The window," Sam shouted. They ran to the murky glass, trying to see something in the impenetrable fog. There was nothing there, only a white, lifeless shroud. But the sound of scraping was coming directly from behind the thin barrier of logs and glass. Sam pressed his palm against the wall. The wood was cold as ice, and he fancied he felt a slight, barely perceptible vibration in it. Suddenly, the scraping stopped. A silence fell, more ominous than the sound itself. Dean and Sam looked at each other, holding their breath. Maybe they'd left. And then a new sound made them flinch and recoil towards the center of the room. A dull, wet thud, as if something large and soft had hit the wall from outside. Then another, and another. This wasn't scraping. It was like someone leaning against the wall, embracing it, pressing against it with their full mass. Simultaneously from two sides. The walls seemed to shudder for a moment. Dust danced in the beam of light Sam directed at the ceiling. "Are they trying to get in?" Dean whispered, his voice filled with nothing but pure terror. "No," Sam forced out, looking again at the page of the logbook. He wrote, "They are inside. They aren't trying to get in. They're checking the cage, sensing us." The idea was so monstrous the mind refused to accept it. But there was no alternative. This cottage wasn't a shelter. It was a trap, and they had locked themselves in it voluntarily. The scraping started again, but now it was different, more insistent, furious. It behaved not like a creature trying to get inside, but like a predator, sharpening its claws on the bars of a cage with prey inside. The sound moved in a circle, shifting from one wall to another, encircling them. Sometimes it faded, sometimes it intensified, but it didn't stop for a second. An hour passed. 2. Time lost all meaning. The fog outside the window didn't dissipate. They sat on the cold floor, back to back, unable to utter a word. The constant monotonous scraping crept into their brains, eating away at their consciousness. It was omnipresent. It was an obsession. It was the only sound in this inside-out world. "I can't take this," Dean hissed through his teeth, clamping his hands over his ears. "They either have to come in or leave." "They can't come in," Sam replied monotonously, staring into the void. "And they can't leave. They are part of this place, as we soon will be." He looked at the logbook lying nearby. The trembling entry. The death plea. Perhaps the last keeper had also first sought shelter here, and then realized he had become part of the exhibition of this cursed place. His job was no longer to watch over the trail. It was to be locked in this box while something outside scraped at the walls, knowing his scent. Suddenly, Dean jumped up. "No," he shouted, addressing not his brother but the walls. "Do you hear me? Get away!" He punched a log. In response, the scraping only intensified, becoming piercing, almost triumphant. Their despair seemed to be exactly what these unseen entities were waiting for. Sam closed his eyes. He no longer heard the scraping. He heard only the whisper, the one the keeper had written about. It wasn't in his ears, but right in his head, born from the very rhythm of those terrible sounds. It consisted not of words, only of sensations, cold curiosity, ancient hunger, and infinite, all-consuming loneliness. He understood that going out, as the keeper had written, didn't mean simply opening the door and stepping into the fog. It meant ceasing to be oneself. It meant becoming the one who scrapes outside, or becoming the one who sits inside until his mind slowly turns to dust. The scraping filled everything. It was in the walls, the floor, the ceiling. It was in their bones. Dean was throwing himself against the door in hysterics, his screams drowned out by the monotonous, relentless scree. Sam sat motionless on the floor, looking at his trembling hand. He no longer felt fear, only a strange, chilling resignation. He was the new keeper, and his watch was just beginning. and the sound outside the walls was now the only thing confirming his existence. He knew their scent, and they knew his, and so it would continue until the next traveler seeking shelter from a mountain downpour knocked from the outside. Time became tangled, turning into a monotonous torture of scraping. Dean, exhausted, slid down the wall by the door and sat, hugging his head, silently rocking back and forth. His thrashing, his screams had dried up, leaving behind only an empty shell in which that brain-piercing sound echoed. Sam felt something different. Panic slowly receded, giving way to a chilling, almost inhuman understanding. He looked at his brother and saw not an ally, but a dying ember. An ember that would soon go out, leaving behind just another source of scent for them, outside the wall. Dean. His voice was hoarse but calm. The scraping ceased for a moment, as if listening. "Dean, listen to me." He didn't answer, just pressed his head harder into his knees. "It's not trying to break down the door," Sam continued, looking at the ceiling, at that point where the shadows converged. "It's not trying to break down the walls. It's cleaning them. Like you clean the cage of a chicken you're preparing for dinner. It's sharpening its tools. It's preparing the space." "Shut up," Dean whispered. He wrote, "I must go out before." Sam slowly rose to his feet. His body ached, but his mind was clear and cold as a blade. "Before I become part of this, part of them, or before I go mad and open the door myself. That's the choice, Dean, to become the one who scrapes, or the one who sits inside until he dies." The scraping resumed, but now there was a hint of approval in it. It became more rhythmic, like the beat of a funeral march. "We have another choice." Sam approached his brother and crouched before him. A strange, detached determination burned in his eyes. "We can choose how this ends. We can deny them the enjoyment." Dean slowly looked up at him. There was terror in his eyes, but somewhere deep down, a faint glimmer of hope. "What are you suggesting?" His voice was a soundless whisper. "We go out," Sam said quietly, "but not the way they want. Not as panicked victims running. We go out on our own terms. One of us opens the door. The other gives us a chance." He pulled a folding knife from his pocket, small but with a razor-sharp blade. Their last shared purchase before the hike. Understanding, slow and horrifying, dawned on Dean's face. "No, Sam, no. It's the only way to break the circle." Sam's voice broke for the first time, the pain he'd been suppressing so hard finally bursting through. "One goes out to distract them, to give the other a chance to run. The fog, it can't last forever. There must be a boundary." "You're insane. There's nothing out there, only them. And what is there in here?" Sam spread his arms wide, pointing at the walls from which the very darkness seemed to seep. "There's slow death in here. There's madness in here. I prefer the quick kind, and I prefer to choose it myself." He held the knife out to his brother, handle first. "Take it." "No." Dean scrambled back, hitting the wall. "I won't." "Then I'll go out unarmed." Sam placed the knife on the floor between them. "And you'll stay here alone, with this." He nodded towards the wall from which the scraping came. "Forever. You'll become the new keeper. You'll keep your logbook until the ink runs out, and then you'll start scratching entries on the walls with your own nails." He saw his words sink into his brother, saw him mentally painting that picture, and the horror of it outweighed the horror of a quick death outside. The scraping suddenly became furious, impatient. The creatures outside the wall seemed to sense the prey preparing an unexpected move. A dull blow sounded, so strong that dust rained from the ceiling. The wall shuddered. Dean squeezed his eyes shut. Tears streamed down his dirty cheeks. He reached out a trembling hand and took the knife. The blade glinted in the semi-darkness. I'll open the door," he whispered, "and go out first. Run, Sam. Run, don't look back. If there's even the slightest chance." Sam nodded, a spasm tightening his throat. It was the worst, most despicable plan in the world. But it was their plan, their final act of free will in this cursed place. They stood up, Dean by the door, gripping the knife handle in his sweaty palm, Sam a few steps behind, ready to sprint. On three, Dean said, and his voice suddenly became firm. It held the resolve of the doomed. One, the scraping stopped. An ominous, oppressive silence fell, full of expectation. Two, Sam saw his brother's back tense. He himself was ready to bolt. Three, Dean roared as he yanked the iron bracket towards himself. The door swung open with a deafening screech, revealing a wall of milky white, motionless fog, and immediately, from the fog, from both sides, shadows darted. They had no form, just clots of moving darkness from which emanated that same smell of old leather, damp earth, and madness. They rushed at Dean. "Run, Sam!" he shouted, slashing the knife in front of him. Sam lunged forward, jumping out of the cottage. The cold of the fog burned his skin. He ran, seeing nothing ahead, hearing nothing but his own heart and the horrifying, wet sounds coming from behind, not screams, but squelching, tearing sounds, interspersed with the fierce, hopeless scraping of steel against something hard. He ran, stumbling over invisible stones, choking on the thick, dead air. He ran, expecting at any moment for the same shadows to reach out from the fog and drag him away. But they weren't there. They were busy. Dean had done his job. Tears streamed down his face, mixing with the fog's moisture. He had betrayed his brother. He had used him as bait, as a bargaining chip for his dubious salvation. The tragedy wasn't just in Dean's death, but in the fact that Sam now had to live with that knowledge. With the fact that his freedom had been bought at such a price. Suddenly he saw an outline ahead, dark, blurred. Another tree, a rock. He ran towards it, hoping it was the boundary, the end of this nightmare, but as he approached, his heart sank. It wasn't a rock or a tree, it was the cottage, the very same keeper's cottage. He had run in a circle. He had run away from it only to return to it from the other side. He stopped, panting before the open door. Inside was darkness. Outside, on the threshold, lay the bloody, forgotten folding knife. There was no trace left of Dean. The silence was absolute again. No scraping, no rustling, and then Sam understood the most terrible truth. Escape was impossible, not because the fog was endless, but because the cottage was the nucleus of this place. Its gravity wasn't physical, but metaphysical. It attracted victims, and it never let them go. He slowly, like an automaton, walked inside. The door quietly clicked shut behind his back, with a soft yet final click. He was home. He walked over to the spot where he had found the logbook. The book lay in the same place. Next to it now lay the bloody knife. Sam sank to his knees. He was the new keeper. His watch was beginning. He took the book, opened it to the last page. With a trembling hand, no longer from fear but from a strange, cold acceptance, he wrote on the blank sheet. Dean tried to go out. They knew, they always know. I remain, I must remain. He didn't finish the phrase. He set the book aside and approached the wall. He ran his fingers over the rough wood. It was cold and lifeless, and then he heard it. At first quiet, barely perceptible. Cree. He squeezed his eyes shut. It wasn't an external sound. It came from within his own mind, from within his soul. Scree. He opened his eyes and looked at his hands. He imagined how one day, perhaps very soon, he himself would rise and begin scraping from the inside against the walls of his eternal prison. Or maybe he was already doing it. Maybe he had always been doing it. Scree. The sound grew louder, more insistent. Sam slowly turned to the wall and, raising his hand, dragged his nails across the wood. Scree. The answering whisper from outside the walls was full of satisfaction. The circle was closed. The tragedy had found its completion and its new beginning. The third story. The Echo Killer. The stone was cold and damp, like the skin of a corpse. Linda pressed herself against the rough surface of the cliff, trying to breathe. But the narrow crevice of the gorge she had fallen into seemed to squeeze her chest itself. One wrong step, one loose rock, and now she was here in a stone trap, wedged between two sheer walls stretching up into a black starless sky. The darkness was so thick you could touch it, feel its velvety, hostile texture. Panic, sticky and cold, rose in her throat. She was an experienced climber, but this night, this place, it was wrong. The air was still and dead, with not a breath of wind, no familiar night rustles, only an oppressive, absolute silence pressing on her eardrums. "Calm down, Linda," she whispered to herself, but even the whisper sounded deafeningly loud. "Shout, call out. The echo will tell you how far the exit is." She took a deep breath, filling her lungs, and shouted with all her might. "Hello, oh!" The sound of her voice hit the walls and flew deep into the gorge, and immediately returned. But it wasn't a simple reflection. It was piercing, unnaturally long, stretched out like a string about to snap. And it was an octave, no, even a tone and a half lower. It wasn't her voice. It was the voice of the gorge. Deep, vibrating hollow, Linda swallowed a lump of fear. A trick of the imagination, she convinced herself. Fatigue, just an acoustic anomaly. She tried again, pouring all her hope and despair into the cry, "He-e-el." The answer came instantly, clear, sharp, hammered out like a blow on an anvil. It came not from all sides, but from one point, from the darkest, most impenetrable depth of the crevice. "E-e-elp yourself." The words were her own, but spoken with a soul-chilling, indifferent calm. A cold sweat, sharp as needles, broke out all over her body. Her heart pounded in her chest, ready to burst out. This wasn't an echo. Echoes didn't form phrases. Echoes didn't answer with such chilling intellect. Panic, which had been dormant at the edge of her consciousness, overwhelmed her, paralyzing her mind. She squeezed her eyes shut, trying to catch her breath, to clench her trembling hands into fists. A hallucination. From the fall, from dehydration. Yes, that was it. She had to check. Verify this monstrous guess. She opened her mouth and her own voice came out hoarse and uncertain. Who's there? Silence. Thick, heavy, mocking. It lasted an eternity. Linda was already thinking she had imagined it. That it really was an anomaly. A trick of sound. And then the echo returned, but it wasn't her voice. It was a voice that made her breath catch and her vision darken. A voice she hadn't heard for a whole year. A voice that haunted her dreams and made her wake up in tears. The low, velvety, beloved voice of her husband Mark, but it held no warmth, no love. Only a chilling terror, as if from the deepest pit of hell. "Don't shout," Mark's voice whispered, and the whisper was full of such desperate animal plea that goosebumps ran down Linda's spine. "You'll wake it." The last word was uttered with such a chilling emphasis, with such an inhuman delivery, that Linda screamed involuntarily. And at the same instant, from the darkness, from that very point the voice had come from, a sound emerged, dry, crackling, disgusting. A sound impossible to confuse with anything else. As if someone huge, with ancient, time-stiffened joints, had begun to slowly, laboriously straighten up. Ikararak. Crunch. Scratch. It was the sound of rusty hinges on an abandoned crypt, the sound of dry branches breaking, yet within it was a monstrous, inhuman power. Linda recoiled, hitting her back against a rock. Her breath caught. She squeezed her eyes shut, then opened them wide again, trying to see something in the pitch blackness. But there was nothing, only the black velvet of night and that terrifying, growing screech. "Mark," she exhaled, her voice breaking into a sob. Is that you?" No answer came. Only the creaking grew louder, closer. It traveled along the gorge, reflecting off the walls, multiplying, turning into a deafening symphony of nightmare. It seemed the gorge itself was waking up, that the stone boulders were beginning to move, stir, straighten their numb limbs. Linda pressed her palms to her ears, but it didn't help. The sound wasn't coming from outside. It was inside her skull, vibrating in her bones. She understood that Mark's voice wasn't help, not comfort. It was a warning, the last cry of a soul locked in this stone hell. Rak. The sound was very close now, right in front of her, a few meters away. Now a heavy wheezing breath joined the creaking. It was wet, gurgling, as if the lungs of the one breathing were filled with water or sand. Her thoughts tangled. A year ago, her and Mark's last hike together. He had gone ahead to scout the trail and never returned. The rescuers found nothing. No body, no gear. The tracks simply ended at an old, unknown gorge. This gorge. And now she was here. And he was here. But he wasn't alone. With a wild, uncontrollable scream, Linda lunged forward away from the sound. She couldn't see the path, didn't think about where she was running. She ran, stumbling over boulders, scratching her hands and face on sharp rock outcrops. The dark walls of the gorge converged before her, guiding her, driving her into a trap. The screeching and wheezing pursued her at her heels. They were everywhere, to the right, left, behind. It seemed it wasn't one creature, but dozens, hundreds, that the entire gorge was a single living, breathing monster. She suddenly burst into a small grotto, a dead end. Moonlight finally broke through a narrow slit high above, illuminating a small space. Linda leaned against the wall, trying to catch her breath. Tears streamed down her face, mixing with dirt and blood. And then she saw him. In the far corner of the grotto, in the shadows, sat a figure. It was hunched over, arms wrapped around its knees. It wore a torn, decayed, unrecognizable jacket. Mark's climbing jacket. Mark, Linda whispered, not believing her eyes. The figure slowly raised its head. Its face wasn't visible, hidden in deep shadow. But the posture, the outline of the shoulders, it was him. He slowly, very slowly raised a hand and pointed a finger somewhere behind Linda. The finger trembled. Slowly, as if in a nightmare, Linda turned around. The entrance to the grotto was now blocked by another figure. Tall, unnaturally thin, with long, disproportionate limbs. It stood completely motionless, only its contours faintly trembling in the moonlight. From it came that same sound, a quiet but incessant creaking of old joints. And a smell. The smell of old, damp earth, rusty metal, and something dead, decomposing in the dark for an eternity. Linda couldn't move. Horror bound her hand and foot, sinking icy claws into her throat. The creature took a step forward. Its movement was sharp, angular, as if it didn't walk, but moved in jerks like a marionette. It tilted its head to the side, and Linda saw that where its face should be, there was only a smooth, shiny, stone-polished hollow. A sound came from this hollow. Not a voice, but her own first shout she had made upon entering the gorge. "Hello, oh." It sounded from the faceless mask, but now it wasn't just a sound. It held mockery, hunger, and ancient, all-consuming evil. It couldn't just repeat sounds. It absorbed them, devoured them, and now it was using them against her. Linda staggered back, bumping into the seated figure of Mark. It collapsed on its side with a dry, bony clatter. This wasn't her husband. This was his skeleton, dressed in rags, propped up grotesquely by sticks. The face was a dried, eyeless mask, the last pathetic trace left by the echo. The creature took another step. Its long, bony arm, with fingers like rusty pincers, slowly reached for her. A scream, wild, inhuman, tore from Linda's chest. She lunged to the side, away from the dead end, away from this nightmare. She ran, not choosing a path, deafened by her own sobs and the rising, all-consuming screech that now sounded right behind her. She understood everything. Mark hadn't just disappeared. He had shouted. He had called for help. And the gorge, this echo killer, had absorbed his voice, his fear, his very essence. And then it had taken his body. And now it was her turn. She ran until her legs gave way and she collapsed onto the stones. She lay, sobbing, her face pressed against the cold stone. The screeching loomed over her. She felt its freezing breath on her neck. She raised her head. Before her was another wall, a dead end. The end, Linda slowly rolled onto her back. The creature stood over her, blocking out the moonlight. Its faceless mask was turned towards her. It slowly bent down, and Linda, gathering the last of her strength, whispered, addressing not it, but the shadow of her husband, to the echo of his love that might still flicker somewhere in this stone. "Forgive me." The creature froze, and from its stone face came Mark's voice, the very same, full of love and tenderness, the way he had spoken to her in the morning before their fateful hike. "It's all right, my love," it whispered. "It's all right." And at that moment, its hand, cold and hard as steel, closed around her throat. The last thing Linda heard, before the darkness consumed her, was her own death rattle, which the gorge immediately picked up, distorted, and stretched into an endless, piercing octave of horror, to one day return it to the next traveler, foolish enough to shout in the night. The darkness was not emptiness. It was filled with echo. The echo of her own final gasp, which continued to vibrate in her bones, mingling with the screeching and whispering. Linda's consciousness did not fade, but dissolved into this sonic chaos. She could not see, could not feel her body, but she heard. She was sound, part of the gorge. Hours or maybe days passed. Time had lost all meaning here. Gradually, the cacophony began to take on structure. She heard not just noise, she heard them. Dozens, hundreds of voices. Whispers, screams, pleas, curses, all of them, like her, had once shouted in this stone trap. And the gorge had preserved them, not as memory but as food, as part of its terrible organism. Among this chorus she recognized one voice. Weak, exhausted, filled with such hopeless anguish that her own, now mute soul, shuddered. "Linda," Mark whispered. His voice was not from outside. It sounded inside her, as if scratching its message from within her consciousness. "Linda, forgive me." She could not answer. She could only listen. "I couldn't warn you. It held me, still holds me. It absorbs everything. Our voices, our thoughts, our pain. It feeds on our fear." Linda mentally strained towards this voice, trying to find some foothold in this sea of sonic madness. "What is it?" She strained to ask, and her thought, having no voice, echoed weakly in the general chorus. "I don't know. Ancient. A living gorge. It doesn't just repeat sounds. It studies us, through our cries, through our pleas. It learns everything about us. It learned about you through me, about our love, about our fear of losing each other, and it used that to lure you in." The tragedy crashed down on Linda with a new, monstrous force. She hadn't come here by accident. She wasn't led here by a wrong turn, but by a deliberate, cruel will. The echo killer had used her love, her longing for her husband, as bait. It had played on her brightest feelings to drag her into the darkest abyss. It makes me... Mark's voice broke off, filled with shame and horror. It uses my voice, my memories, to wake others, to lure them in like it lured you. I've become its bait, its tool. Linda remembered that tender, loving whisper that had sounded just before the end. "It's all right, my love." It wasn't a mockery. It was the most refined torture. The echo had pulled from the depths of Mark's memory, the most intimate moment, the most desired deception, and used it to lull her vigilance at the last moment, to make hope the antechamber of the end. Suddenly she felt a presence, vast, cold, bottomless, the very one that stood at the center of all this nightmare. The consciousness of the echo. It did not think in words. It thought in sounds, vibrations, echoes. It was like a giant, perverted musical instrument, tuned to the frequency of fear, and it turned its attention to her. A wave of alien will crashed over her, crushing her fragile consciousness. She felt a burning interest, hunger. The echo was studying her, as it had studied Mark and hundreds of others. It rummaged through her memories, searching for the brightest, most painful sounds. Before her mind's eye, woven from darkness and noise, images surfaced. Her son, little Leo, laughing heartily in his crib. A ringing, pure, joyful sound, and immediately the gorge responded. It reproduced this laughter, but it was distorted, stretched, pierced with icy emptiness. It turned joy into a sinister mockery. The echo was devouring her love for her son, defiling her most sacred memory. No, she screamed soundlessly. "Leave him alone!" In response came a new sound, Leo's crying. That very same, bitter, inconsolable cry from when he had fallen and scraped his knee as a child. And this cry, too, was perverted, filled not with a child's hurt, but with an adult, universal despair. The echo was experimenting. It was looking for the most effective ways to cause pain. It was collecting her sonic collection, her personal symphony of horror. Then came the turn of the most terrible memory. Her last conversation with Mark before his disappearance. She stood in the doorway. He was already packing his backpack. "Don't go today," she said, and her voice held an anxiety she didn't understand herself. "The weather is turning. Don't worry, I'll be back for dinner." He smiled. Those were his last words to her. "I'll be back." And now the gorge played back this dialogue. But Mark's voice was flat, lifeless, and her own "don't go" sounded like a piercing, prophetic shriek of doom. The echo had bound these two sounds into an eternal, cursed loop, hope and doom. "It will never let us go," Mark whispered again, and his voice was full of a strange calm of despair. "We are its voice now. We are its library of fear. We will lure others forever." Linda felt herself beginning to erode. Her memories, her personality, her pain, all of it was turning into raw material, into a tool for torture. She was becoming not Linda, but another voice crying in the night, another whisper of despair that would one day fall from the stone lips of the echo to break the will of the next victim. She tried to resist. She tried to remember something bright, something that couldn't be distorted. But any thought, any memory was immediately picked up, copied, distorted, and returned to her as a nightmarish parody. And then she understood the most terrible truth. Physical death would have been a mercy. The echo did not kill bodies. It collected souls. It turned them into eternally suffering, self-aware echoes of their own torment. Suddenly, a new sound burst into the general noise. Fresh, real, full of life. A human voice, frightened and uncertain. "Hey, is anyone there?" A new traveler, lost, frightened by the night. Linda felt a sharp, burning impulse from the center of the echo's consciousness. Hunger, excitement, a command, and immediately, against her will, her own voice, the very same as in life, clear and strong, tore from her mute lips, or rather, from the essence she had become. "Help!" A voice shouted, filled with perfectly simulated hope and fear. "I'm here!" "I'm lost!" It was her voice, but it wasn't her. It was a doll, a puppet controlled by the echo. She had become bait, just as Mark had once become. "No," she pleaded inside. "Don't listen, run." But her genuine, soundless cry was drowned in the chorus of other such souls who had also become instruments of the call. And then, from the other end of the gorge, came another voice. Low, calm, full of faint concern. Mark's voice. "Come here, friend," it said, and its tone was deceptively warm. "I know the way out. I'll help you." The trap snapped shut. The echo was playing a duet, using their love, their voices, their very essence to lure a new person into the eternal stone dungeon. Linda watched indifferently as her will completely dissolved. She was no longer Linda the climber. She was an echo, a whisper in the dark, a cry for help that led to doom. Her tragedy was not over. It had become eternal, and with every new cry, with every new caught echo, the gorge grew larger, hungrier, smarter, and in the distance, growing louder. A new sound could already be heard, and the dry, crackling screech of old, rusty joints straightening. It was preparing for a new feast. The fourth story, the wrong fire. Vanessa was the first to give up. Her legs, shredded to blood by the thorny undergrowth, simply refused to go any further. She collapsed onto the soft, rotten carpet of pine needles, and her quiet sobs became the soundtrack to their collective despair. The Utah forest, which had seemed so picturesque and friendly during the day, had transformed with the onset of darkness into a hostile, breathing maze. The air, recently filled with the scent of pines, had become thick and stifling. Justin, the unofficial leader of their small group, stabbed uselessly at the dead screen of his smartphone. No signal, no map, no compass. Brilliant, guys. Just brilliant. His voice trembled with rage and fear. Maybe stop looking for someone to blame. Mel snapped sharply, putting an arm around Judy, who was staring into the darkness with eyes wide with horror. Travis, the strongest and most silent of them, just stood there, gripping the handle of his multi-tool so hard his knuckles were white. They were just a group of college students who had decided to spend the weekend on a hiking trip, a fun adventure meant to bond them before graduation. Now that adventure threatened to be their last. It was Travis who saw it first. Light. His hoarse whisper sounded like a gunshot. Over there. Through a palisade of dark trunks, in a hollow between hills, a point flickered. Small but incredibly bright, orange and strangely with a slight greenish tint. A fire. Justin's spirit soared. Let's go. Hope, sharp and intoxicating, gave them strength. They almost ran, stumbling, pushing branches aside, ignoring the scratches. But as they got closer, anxiety began to displace euphoria. The air filled with a strange, suffocating smell. It smelled of smoke, but not the cozy smoke of a campfire, rather an acrid chemical burning. And beneath that smell was something else, a sweetish, nauseating aroma of spoiled raw meat on the verge of rotting. What the hell is burning here? Mel grimaced, covering her nose with her sleeve. Finally, they broke into a clearing and froze. The fire was burning, bright, high, almost knee-high. The flame was unnatural, dazzling white in the center, with poisonously green tongues at the edges that licked the logs without a single crackle. The fire was silent, and that was the most frightening thing. It didn't crackle, it didn't roar. It just burned, like a giant, silent candle. Around the fire there were no tents, no gear, no people. Nothing that indicated a camp, only 3 stumps. They stood in a circle at equal distances from each other, forming a perfect triangle around the fire. The stumps were old, crookedly hewn as if chopped down with a dull axe many years ago. The bark had peeled off, exposing dark, almost black wood. Where is everyone? Judy whispered. Justin, trying to take control, stepped forward. Hey, anyone here? The answer was only an oppressive silence, broken by their own heavy breathing. The smell of burnt pine needles and meat grew stronger, causing mild nausea. Let's get out of here, Travis said firmly. His instincts were screaming danger. This place is wrong. They turned to leave, and that's when Vanessa, still sitting on the ground, screamed and scrambled backward, pointing a trembling finger at the stumps. Oh my God. Look, Justin moved closer, squinting in the dim firelight. Letters were carved into the surface of each stump, deep, uneven, as if carved with a knife or a sharp stone. On the first stump, the smallest, was carved J and V. Justin and Vanessa on the second, larger one, T and M, Travis and Mel. On the third, the largest and most massive, stood a solitary letter J, Judy, and next to her initial was an empty, meticulously cleared space. A perfectly even rectangle, as if waiting for a 4th set of letters. A 4th person. But there were 5 of them. Icy horror, slow and relentless, crept through their veins. "Is this a joke?" Justin choked out. "Someone knew we were coming." "Who?" Mel's voice broke into a falsetto. "We didn't know where we were going ourselves." Travis walked over to the stump with his initials and ran his fingers over the carved letters. The wood wasn't just dark. It was sticky and damp, as if soaked in something old and dried up. He pulled his hand back. "The carving is fresh," he stated grimly. "The wood inside is light." At that moment, the green fire flared and shot a shower of sparks upward. The shadows from the stumps lengthened sharply, momentarily taking on ugly, elongated shapes. They thought they saw not shadows from wood, but shadows of people tied to those stumps. Judy screamed. Piercingly, hysterically, she turned and ran back into the forest. "Judy!" "Stop!" Justin yelled, but it was too late. She took only a few steps before tripping over an invisible root and falling heavily. A disgusting wet crunch sounded. Judy thrashed in silent agony, gasping for air, her leg twisted at an impossible angle. Panic became tangible, alive. They rushed to her. Travis and Justin tried to lift her, but the pain was so unbearable she screamed again. "We can't carry her." Vanessa was almost sobbing. "We can barely stand ourselves. We can't leave her here." Justin snapped. While they argued, Mel, trying to distract herself from the nightmare, looked back at the fire. And her blood froze in her veins. The flame had changed. Inside the green tongues, shadows now writhed. Not just shadows, but silhouettes. 3 human figures contorting in the fire, screaming soundlessly. They were barely discernible, like an image on a bad TV. But Mel recognized the posture of one of them, curled up, exactly like Judy's. "Don't look at the fire," she screamed, but it was too late. Travis, looking up, saw it too. His face contorted into a grimace of horror. They're moving." And then, from the depths of the forest from where they had come, a sound reached them. Not the wind, not an animal. It was a heavy, measured scraping, as if something huge and metallic was being dragged over stones. Grrr. The sound was getting closer. "We have to put out the fire." It dawned on Justin. It attracted this thing. He grabbed his empty water bottle and rushed towards the fire. But as soon as he got closer, the flames shot higher, and a wave of unbearable heat hit him in the face. This was no ordinary fire. It didn't scorch. It seemed to burn the very soul. Justin staggered back, feeling his eyes sting and his head spin. Skrrr, S-C-R-R-R-R. The sound was right at the edge of the clearing now. They saw branches swaying and breaking in the darkness. Something large was forcing its way through the thicket. Travis pulled out his multi-tool, opening the largest blade. His hand was shaking. "Everyone behind me." It emerged from the forest. It was not an animal, and it was not a man. The creature was huge, built of dark, cracked wood and rusty metal scraps. Its body resembled a crude wooden idol, crowned not with a head but a tangle of roots, among which a single glass-like eye gleamed dully. One of its arms was simply a gnarled stump of a branch, the other, a shard of a scythe sharpened to a razor's edge, strapped to its forearm with dirty leather straps. It was with this shard that it produced that grating sound, dragging it along the ground. It stopped at the edge of the clearing. Its glass eyes slowly, without blinking, scanned them all. Then it stopped on Judy lying on the ground. From deep within the creature, from its very wooden chest, came a sound. Not a voice, but a semblance of a voice. The creak of old wood and the clang of metal forming something like words. The fourth. For the stump. It took a step forward. Travis charged at it with a roar. He was strong, an athlete, but his knife strike bounced off the wooden body, leaving only a scratch. The creature didn't even flinch. It swung its scythe arm. The movement was swift and precise. Travis froze. At first he didn't understand. Then he looked down. A deep gash split his chest from collarbone to waist. It didn't bleed. The edges of the wound were charred as if he hadn't been cut, but cauterized with a red-hot blade. He fell to his knees, making a strange hissing sound, and froze, as if turned to wood. "No," Mel screamed. The creature ignored her. It moved towards Judy. Justin and Vanessa scrambled backward in horror to the very edge of the forest. They were paralyzed with fear. The creature leaned over Judy. She thrashed helplessly in its shadow, trying to crawl away. It reached out its gnarled hand and touched her forehead. Judy's body shook with convulsions. Her skin began to darken, covered with fine cracks like bark on an old tree. Her scream turned into a hoarse, dry grating. Her hair tangled and blackened, turning into something like moss. The process took mere seconds. Where a living girl had just lain, now stood another crooked, charred stump. The creature straightened up. Its glass eye slowly shifted to the survivors, to Justin, Vanessa, and Mel, standing over Travis's petrified body. 3. "Names, wait," it rasped. It didn't run after them. It simply took a step in their direction, and that was enough. Justin and Vanessa, without a word, turned and fled into the thicket. They ran, not choosing a path, thinking of nothing but one thing: to run away from this place, from this fire, from this forest, which turned out to be not just a forest but a giant, living slaughterhouse. Mel didn't run. She looked at Travis's blackened body, at his glazed eyes. She looked at the new stump that had once been Judy. Then she looked at the fire. Inside the green flame, 4 figures now writhed. She understood. Running was useless. The forest belonged to it, and the fire wasn't just a flame. It was an altar, a place where the living were turned into fuel for its eternal wrong burning. The creature stood and watched her. It waited. Mel slowly raised her head. There was no fear in her eyes, no tears, only emptiness. "I'm coming," she said quietly, and stepped forward towards her fate, towards the stump with the initials T and M, to take her designated empty place and forever become part of this cursed circle. The 5th story, the family song. The fog didn't come from the sea. It descended from the mountains, white and thick as milk, swallowing the path, the pines, the sky. In a matter of minutes, the world had shrunk to the size of a wet, cold spot, in the center of which stood Evelyn and George. Their golden wedding trip to the Scottish Highlands had turned into a nightmare. "George?" Evelyn's voice trembled, lost in the cotton wool silence. She squeezed her husband's hand, and her fingers, thin and age-spotted, sought in his palm a support she hadn't been able to find for a whole hour. "I'm here, darling, here." George tried to make his baritone sound confident, but fear tightened his throat. He poked at his smartphone, but the screen stubbornly showed only the no-service icon. The compass in his pocket spun wildly, as if mocking them. "Stay put, the main thing is not to move. They're looking for us." "Who are they, George?" whispered Evelyn. "We didn't tell anyone we were taking this walk." It was a cruel irony. 45 years of marriage, and they'd decided to celebrate by getting lost in the mountains like a pair of stupid teenagers. The cold seeped through their thin jackets, moisture settling on their faces like the tiniest diamond tears. Evelyn felt panic, cold and sticky, approaching her heart. She needed to calm down, pull herself together, and then she began to hum. At first, very quietly, almost soundlessly. It was their song, the very one that had played at their wedding, that they'd danced to in the living room with their newborn son in their arms, that they'd sung around the campfire on their first trip together. The simple, sweet melody of Loch Lomond. Her lips themselves formed the familiar words. "You hope, my lassie." "Oh." George flinched. "Evie, don't." "Quiet." But it was too late. From the fog right in front of them came a second voice. It picked up the melody, impeccably pure. It was a high child's voice, clear and crystalline, like the angels on Christmas cards sing. But the words were wrong. Instead of "by yon bonny banks and by yon bonny braes," the voice sang, stretching the syllables with a sweet, almost lullaby-like intonation. "By yon bloody stones and by yon bleeding clay." Evelyn fell silent, her mouth still agape. The slight smile brought on by memories froze and slowly slid from her face, giving way to bewilderment and the first, still unconscious horror. The voice continued, and the melody so familiar and dear suddenly became alien, sinister. Where the sun it sleeps and the earth does crawl, you'll take the long road down into the wool. George lunged at his wife and roughly with his palm clamped his hand over her mouth. "Quiet," he hissed, and in his eyes was an animal fear that Evelyn hadn't seen since the war. They stood, pressed against each other, holding their breath. Evelyn's heart beat so hard it seemed it would tear itself from her chest, and the voice sang on. Now it was closer, just a few steps away. It delivered a dreadful verse. Your bones will crack on the step so cold, a story forever to be told. Down, down, down the silent stair, to join the other children there. And then George realized something terrible, soul-chilling. The sound wasn't coming from the fog in front of them. It wasn't coming from the side. It was vibrating in the ground. It was rising from beneath their feet. With a cry of horror, he recoiled, pulling Evelyn with him. And at that same moment, the fog at their feet began to melt. Not dissipate, but actually melt, like clumps of cotton wool carried away by an invisible wind. The white shroud retreated, revealing what had been hidden all this time. There was no ground beneath their feet. They were standing on the very edge, on a narrow, crumbling ledge of clay and rubble, and right in front of them, below them, gaped a crevice, deep as the mouth of hell. Its edges, black and wet, plunged down into impenetrable darkness, the stone throat of a gorge, and the song, that same perverted, blasphemous version of their family anthem, rose from the bottom of this abyss. A child's voice, pure and innocent, sang of blood, stones, and the need to go down. "No," Evelyn moaned, staring into the blackness. "No, this can't be." George tried to pull her back, but his legs gave way. He stared into the chasm, and his mind refused to accept what he saw. Deep below, in the thick of the darkness, he caught a faint phosphorescent glow, like rotten wood. And in that faint light he thought he saw movement, something pale, small, moving in time with the dreadful lullaby. The voice sang, and now the words came clearly, as if the singer were standing right next to them behind their backs. "The door of stone is waiting wide. Step inside, step inside. Lay down your love. Lay down your years and wash away your mortal tears. With us down here." Evelyn, still unable to comprehend what was happening, mechanically in a whisper, finished the line from there, the real song. "And I will be..." From the abyss, immediately without pause, came the reply. The same child's voice, but now with a sly, triumphant smile in it. "Right here, my dear. Right here. With me." Something touched Evelyn's leg. Something cold and rough, like stone. She screamed and looked down. From the crevice clinging to the ledge with tiny, chalk-white fingers, a girl was crawling out. Her skin was deathly white and semi-transparent, like that of a deep-sea creature. Long, tangled hair, black as the abyss itself, hid her face. She was dressed in the tatters of what was once a white dress, decayed beyond recognition, and she was singing. Her mouth, hidden by her hair, was the source of that same pure, soul-chilling voice. "Down, down, down," she sang slowly with inhuman strength, pulling herself onto the ledge. George growled, old, sick. For a moment he became that strong young man again who could protect his girl. He lunged forward to push the creature away, to shove it back into the abyss, but his foot slipped from the wet edge. The stone beneath it crunched and gave way. "George!" Evelyn screamed. He fell down. Not into the abyss, no. He fell onto a narrow ledge about 1.5 meters below. The impact against the stone was deafening. He lay motionless, and a dark puddle of blood began to spread around his temple. "George!" Evelyn fell to her knees, reaching for him, but he was too far away, and the small, pale hand was already on her shoulder. The touch was icy, paralyzing. The singing stopped. The girl raised her head. From under the black, damp strands, no face was visible. only a smooth, eyeless, noseless, mouthless mask of the same deathly white skin, and then from the depths of the crevice, by the hundreds, a chorus rose. Thousands of children's voices picked up the melody. They sang that same wrong song, and their voices merged into a deafening, otherworldly hymn, inviting them down. The creature on the ledge tightened its fingers on Evelyn's shoulder. The strength was incredible. The old woman felt herself being pulled towards the edge. She didn't resist. She looked down at her husband's body, at his grey hair matted with blood. She looked into the black maw of the gorge from which this dreadful chorus poured, and quietly, through the ringing in her ears and the growing roar, she whispered, "I'll take the high road, and you'll take the low road." The pale creature jerked her with inhuman force. Evelyn fell from the edge, but she didn't fall into the abyss. She fell next to George on the narrow ledge. Pain shot through her leg, but she was alive. She pressed against his cold cheek. "I'm here, darling. I'm with you." And from above, from the edge of the precipice, that same figure watched them, faceless and motionless. The chorus in the depths fell silent. And then Evelyn heard a new sound. A scraping, scratching sound. She looked up. The creature was still standing up there. It slowly dragged its pale fingers across the stone of the crevice's edge. And on the surface, with a crack, as if it weren't basalt but soft chalk, deep scratches appeared. It was carving letters. Evelyn, squinting. "Read." "I can wait." Then the figure turned and silently dissolved into the fog, which began to thicken again, descending into the crevice like a theater curtain. The cold, white gloom closed over them. She and George were trapped, on a tiny ledge above the abyss, in the company of only the dead hum rising from below and a promise carved in stone. She hugged her husband's body and closed her eyes. The fog swallowed everything. Only darkness, cold, and the quiet, obsessive melody that now sounded only in her head remained. And words that would never be the same again. They waited. Time lost all meaning. It flowed like thick honey, clinging to consciousness, stretching every second into an eternity. Evelyn sat with her back against the cold, rough rock, holding George's lifeless body. His head lay in her lap, and she slowly, with bated breath, stroked his grey hair, trying not to look at the dark stains spreading on the stone beneath his temple. The fog was everywhere, not just white, but phosphorescent, deathly. It consumed sound, light, hope. Sometimes Evelyn heard a distant, chilling whisper. Not a song, but individual words, fragments of phrases whispered by dozens, hundreds of children's voices. "Cold. Mummy. Come to us." "Forever." She covered her ears, but the whisper didn't come from outside. It was born right inside her skull, as if someone were rummaging through her memory, searching for the weakest, most vulnerable places. The first thought was of her son, Michael, her little boy, who had died at age 7, drowning in a lake during a picnic. She had always blamed herself. Looked away for just a minute, just 1 minute, and the fog answered her. From the white shroud right in front of her, a silhouette slowly emerged. Short, childlike. Evelyn's heart skipped a beat. "Michael?" she whispered, her voice breaking with hope and terror. The silhouette grew clearer. It was him, in his little blue shorts and striped t-shirt. He stood with his back to her. "Michael, son," she called, and tears streamed from her eyes. The boy slowly turned. His face was pale and blurred, like in an old photograph. But he was smiling, that same toothless smile that drove her crazy with tenderness. And then he spoke in that same crystalline singing voice that had sung the nightmare song. "Why didn't you save me, Mummy? It's so cold here." The water was very cold. Evelyn screamed and squeezed her eyes shut. "No, you're not real." When she dared to look again, the silhouette was gone. But the whisper in her head grew more insistent, more biting. "He's with us, Evelyn. He's down here. We play with him. Do you want to join him?" It was torture. Targeted, sophisticated. The entity, whatever it was, didn't just want her body. It craved her mind. It wanted her to voluntarily go mad and step into the abyss herself. She tried to think of something bright. Of her first dance with George. Of his laughter. But the fog immediately distorted the memories. Instead of a gentle waltz, that cursed song began to sound in her head. And George's face in the photograph of her memory contorted into the mask of terror she had seen in his last seconds of life. She looked at the inscription on the stone. I can wait. It was waiting. Waiting for fear, loneliness, and guilt to do its work for it. Hours passed. Or maybe days. Thirst and hunger became dull, background sensations against the rising madness. She began to hear George's voice. Evie. A weak, hoarse whisper came from somewhere to the right. She turned sharply. No one, only fog. Evie, help me. It hurts. It was his voice. The real one. With that slight hoarseness he had in the mornings. Evelyn's heart constricted. I'm here, darling. She cried into the void. They're pulling me down, Evie. Don't give me to them. She sobbed, pressing his cold hand to her cheek. It was the most refined blow. It was playing on her love, on her desire to protect him even after death. I won't give you to anyone, she whispered, kissing his stiffened fingers. I promise, but the voice didn't stop. It pleaded, persuaded, reproached, said that if she truly loved him, she should follow him. That only together would they find peace. And the most terrible thing, a part of her, exhausted by fear and grief, began to see the logic in it. What was she doing here on this cold stone with a dead husband? Why cling to a life that had brought her only pain? Slowly, like a sleepwalker, she rose to her feet. The leg she had probably broken in the fall ached sharply, but the pain was distant, almost pleasant. She walked to the very edge of the ledge and looked down. The fog below swirled, and in its depths, that same pale, phosphorescent glow flickered again. Now she saw more. They weren't just lights, they were faces. Dozens, hundreds of pale, faceless children's faces looking up at her from below. They resembled that girl, the same deathly whiteness, the same eyeless smoothness. And they were singing. Now quietly, almost inaudibly, just a rustling, multi-voiced whisper, like the sound of a seashell held to the ear. But she could make out the words clearly. Step inside. Step inside. She felt an irresistible desire to step forward. Just take one step, and it would all be over. The pain, the fear, the guilt. She would be reunited with George and Michael. She had already shifted her weight to her good leg, preparing for the final movement of her life, when her gaze fell on George's hand. On his wedding ring, simple gold. They had bought it in a little shop when they were poor students, and in her memory, clear and vivid, his voice surfaced, but this time the real one, the one that had sounded many years ago when he had placed that ring on her finger. I will be with you in sorrow and in joy until death do us part. But even after, Evie, I will fight for you, always. It wasn't just a memory. It was an epiphany, a sensation of his presence, his will. He wasn't calling her into the abyss. He was asking her to fight. She recoiled from the edge as if from a hot stove and collapsed onto the stone again, breathing heavily. The madness retreated for a moment, giving way to a clarity cold and sharp as a blade. It couldn't take her by force. It needed her consent. It fed on despair. It was a parasite living in her weaknesses. The whisper in her head turned into a furious, malevolent hiss. The children's voices howled with rage. Michael's silhouette flashed in the fog, but now his smile was distorted by a grimace of hatred. "You're a bad mother," he screeched. "You abandoned me then, and you'll abandon me now." Evelyn closed her eyes and began to hum, not the perverted song. Their song, the real one, Loch Lomond, quietly, in a breaking voice but with stubborn determination. "You take the high road and I'll take the low road." The fog around her stirred like boiling water. The whisper became deafening, trying to drown her out. Ghostly hands from the white shroud reached for her but did not dare to touch. "And I'll be in Scotland afore you," she sang, pouring into every word all her love for George, all her longing for Michael, all her will to live. She sang it in their faces. She sang to her fear, "But me and my true love will never meet again." On the last line, her voice grew stronger. She opened her eyes and looked straight into the swirling darkness. On the bonny banks of Loch Lomond. The whisper ceased. Silence fell, deep ringing, full of fury. The phosphorescent lights below went out. It hadn't left. She felt its presence, vast, ancient, insulted by her resistance. It was still waiting, but the game had changed now. Evelyn hugged George's body and pressed against him. She didn't know if she would be saved, but she knew one thing: she was no longer a passive victim. She had declared war, and her weapons were her memories, her love, and her mind, which she refused to surrender. And below, in the absolute silence, a grinding sound was heard again, slow and inexorable, as if something huge and made of stone was beginning to stir in the depths, awakening from her daring challenge. The waiting was over. Now the hunt began. The sixth story. The shoe swap. The last few miles David walked on sheer willpower. His feet were on fire, every muscle in his thighs and back screaming for an end to this madness. The thick pine forest of the Appalachian Trail, which had seemed friendly and picturesque in the morning, had turned into an endless, monotonous labyrinth by evening, pulling him deeper into its damp, dark embrace. He was an experienced solo hiker, but today something had gone wrong. He'd gotten lost trying to take a shortcut and was now reaping the rewards of his overconfidence. "Enough," he rasped to himself, stopping and leaning on his knees. "Just 5 minutes." His gaze fell on an old, mighty pine tree. It stood a little off the barely visible path, its bark covered in deep wrinkles, its branches like huge hands forming a dense, dark canopy overhead. It looked like the perfect place to lean against, catch his breath, and check his map. He dropped his backpack, set it on the ground with a dull thud, and leaned his back against the rough trunk. The coolness of the wood, mixed with the scent of resin and damp earth, felt like bliss. He closed his eyes just for a second, just to give his eyelids a rest. When he opened them again, the sun had almost disappeared below the horizon, casting long, ugly blue shadows. He had slept for a whole hour. His head was heavy, foggy, as if after a deep faint. He stretched, about to get up, and his gaze slid down to his feet, and froze. His heart skipped a beat, then began to race at a frantic pace, pounding dully in his temples. His new, expensive, perfectly broken-in hiking boots were gone from his feet. In their place were others, old, terribly old. The leather was cracked, covered in dried mud and some dark, rust-like stains. The laces were broken and hastily tied in knots. The sole on the right boot was coming off, exposing a damp, dark interior. They smelled. They smelled of dampness, sweat, and something else. Sweetish and putrid, like a rag long forgotten in a remote corner. What the... He jerked away from the tree, recoiling as if from red-hot iron. He frantically scanned the ground around the pine. His backpack was in place. The survival axiom, never part with your gear, had worked on a subconscious level while he slept. And then he saw them, absolutely new, gleaming with cleanliness, his spare boots. The very ones he had so carefully packed at the very bottom of his backpack and left in his tent. In the tent that was camped at least 15 miles from here, they lay neatly, parallel to each other, right at the roots of the pine, as if they had just been taken out of the box and put on display. An icy wave of panic washed over David, tightening his throat. This was impossible, absolutely physically impossible. No one knew where he was. No one could hike 15 miles through wilderness, find his tent, take those specific boots, find him in this back country, and silently swap his footwear while he slept. His mind feverishly searched for a logical explanation. Bears, no too neat. Other hikers. A cruel joke? But it would take superhuman effort and luck to get here, and then his brain, lagging by a few seconds, finally processed the most important, most monstrous fact. If these boots are here, then someone brought them. Someone had been here. Right next to him, someone had taken his boots off and put these tattered remnants on him. Someone had watched him while he slept. David froze, holding his breath, his eyes wildly scanning the surrounding forest. Twilight was thickening, turning the space between the trees into a solid black wall. Nothing. Not the slightest movement. Only the quiet, barely audible rustle of leaves above. And then he heard it, a quiet, shuffling sound. Not the crunch of branches or the rustle of foliage. It was a sound of friction. A heavy, wet sound, as if something large and clumsy was dragging its feet along the ground, stuffed into tight, uncomfortable footwear. Shh. Shh. The sound didn't come from the front, not from the side. It came from behind his back, from behind that very pine tree he had just been leaning against. David slowly, with immense effort, forced himself to turn around. No one. Only the huge dark trunk of the pine and the thickening darkness behind it. Shh. Shh. The sound grew slightly louder. Now within it, one could discern not just shuffling, but a short, wheezing inhalation in time with each step. Someone was breathing heavily with strain, as if every movement was a huge effort, and that someone was clearly trying to get used to new, uncomfortable footwear. To his footwear, who's there? David shouted, and his voice sounded unnaturally loud and hoarse in the advancing silence. The shuffling stopped. A ringing silence fell, full of expectation, and then from behind the pine, from the darkness, came a sound, not a voice. It was like the creak of old wood mixed with a wet gurgle. A bit tight. The thing rasped. The word was drawn out, full of agonizing discomfort. But smells fresh. David stumbled backward, tripping over his own feet shod in these cursed boots. He was seized by a primal, all-consuming panic. He turned and ran. He ran, not choosing a path, thinking of nothing but one thing. To run away from this place, from this sound, from this monstrous exchange. He ran, stumbling over roots, lashing his face with branches. The new alien boots chafed his feet, but he barely felt the pain, trampled by adrenaline. He ran until his lungs were on fire and hammers pounded in his temples. Finally, completely exhausted, he stopped, leaning against another tree, and began to greedily gulp air. He looked around. Deep twilight. He was completely disoriented. And he was alone. He looked at his feet, at these old, tattered boots. And then it hit him. He hadn't just swapped shoes with some creature. He had taken its old pair, and it had put on his new ones. What if this wasn't just an exchange? What if it was a ritual? A transfer of something? A curse? Or identity? With a wild sob, he bent down and began frantically untying the knots on the laces. He had to take them off, burn them, throw them away. The laces, old and rotten, broke in his fingers. He yanked the boot by the heel. It wouldn't budge. It fit his foot perfectly, as if molded to it. David pulled harder, scratching his hands on the rough leather. The boot didn't move. It seemed to have grown onto his foot. Moreover, David fancied he felt a slight, barely perceptible warmth emanating from this old leather, as if the boots were alive. Desperate, he grabbed the tree trunk, trying to use it as a lever to pull off the cursed shoe. At that moment, his gaze fell on the ground near his feet. On the soft, damp soil, a fresh track was clearly visible. The imprint of a sole, of his new, clean pair of boots. The track led deeper into the forest, and then, from somewhere very close, that terrible, shuffling sound came again. Shh, shh. It was much closer, and now it lacked its former clumsiness. The steps were more confident, firmer. The creature was getting used to it, getting shod. getting acquainted. And somewhere in the dark, 15 miles away, in his tent lay a pair of old tattered boots, now waiting for their new owner. He froze, pressing himself against the tree trunk, trying to become a part of it, to dissolve into the rough bark. The shuffling was getting closer, now from the opposite side. The creature was moving in a circle, closing him in an invisible trap. Shh, shh. The sound was methodical, relentless, like the ticking of a clock in a dying man's room. David squeezed his eyes shut, praying it was just a nightmare, a hallucination from exhaustion. But the cold sweat on his back and the relentless pressure on his feet from the boots were terrifyingly real. He yanked at the lace again. This time the skin on his fingers cracked, blood welling up. The boot didn't even twitch. It wasn't just tight. It was a part of him now. Like a cast. Or handcuffs. Leave me alone. He rasped into the darkness and his voice broke into a sob. He was a strong man, used to relying on himself. But this quiet, methodical torture was breaking him from the inside. In response, from the thicket, came that same creaky, gurgling voice. Now it held not just the pain of tight shoes, but something else. Curiosity. Running. Fatigue. Sweat. The creature whispered, and David imagined it licking its lips. Old feelings. Forgotten. Thank you. An icy shiver ran down David's spine. It hadn't just put on his shoes. It had taken something from his essence, from his experience. The sensations of his body. He ran again, not as a man striving for salvation, but as a hunted animal, desperately trying to escape its own shadow. He ran, and with every step, these cursed boots seemed to absorb his panic, his despair, his exhaustion. And somewhere behind, always maintaining the same distance, confident, strengthening shuffling could be heard. The creature was in no hurry. It was enjoying the process. It was finishing off his will. After an hour of frantic running through the dark forest, he collapsed to his knees by a small stream. He gulped water convulsively, trying to quench the fire in his throat, and in the reflection of the black water, he saw his face. It was gray, haggard, with a mad gleam in his eyes. And then he understood the most terrible truth of this night. He wasn't running from the creature. He was running from himself, from the part he had given to it. He looked at his hands. They were shaking. He had always prided himself on his strength, his endurance. And now that very endurance, that ability to endure pain and push forward, didn't belong only to him. It was out there in the dark, wearing his boots and step by step, taking his strength, his perseverance. "What are you?" he groaned, addressing the darkness. From behind the trunk of an old birch tree standing on the other side of the stream came an answer. The voice was less creaky now, smoother, almost human. "I am the one who follows," the creature said. Its words were still slow, but now they held a terrifying clarity. "I am the echo. I am the shadow. I am the emptiness that fills." It took a step out of the shadows. Moonlight fell on it, and David stifled a scream. The creature was still tall, dark and angular, but its outlines had become less blurred. It stood upright. Its movements were no longer shuffling and clumsy. It wore his new boots with growing grace. And on its hands, pale and long, David saw his own signature worn in specific places, climbing gloves. The very accessory he considered his talisman. You're becoming me," David whispered in horror. "No." The creature's voice sounded almost soft. "I am becoming who you were. Your strength, your endurance, your skills. You are giving me your skin, your survivor's shell. And I am leaving you my emptiness." The creature raised its hand and pointed a long, pale finger at David. "Soon you will forget how to light a fire. You will forget how to read a map. You will lose confidence in every step you take, because all of that is now passing to me. And your boots." It chuckled, a sound like the cracking of dry branches. "Your boots won't let you run away. They will bind you to the ground, to your new weakness." David looked at his hands, at these old boots. He felt something leaving. Not physical strength, but something more important. An inner core. The confidence that he could survive any situation. It was melting away like smoke, transferring to this creature that now stood before him, increasingly resembling his own distorted reflection. He remembered his first solo hike, conquering his fear. How he learned to navigate by the stars. How he was proud of every new callus because it was a sign of a path traveled. All of that was his essence. And now it was being stolen, methodically, mercilessly. Why? He exhaled, and his voice held nothing but crushing despair. Because it has always been this way, the creature replied, taking another step across the stream. The water flowed around its boots but didn't seem to wet them. One loses, another finds. I was the one who lost everything before you, and now it's your turn. Run, David, run while you can. Fill these old boots with your fear. Make them valuable for the one who comes after you. And it laughed. It was the most horrible sound David had ever heard in his life, because in that laughter he recognized echoes of his own. He got up and ran again. But now his run was different. It wasn't a panicked flight, but a slow, heavy, exhausting movement. His legs felt like cotton wool. His head spun. He stumbled over every bump, every root. He forgot how to place his foot correctly, how to distribute his weight. The cursed boots pulled him down, to the ground, to the dirt, to weakness. And behind, gaining speed and confidence, walked his double. Walking to take everything that remained, his memories, his personality, his very self. David understood that this was the end. He wouldn't die. No, he would become this creature. A pale, empty shadow, shod in someone's old boots, doomed to forever pursue the next victim to take their life and pass on its emptiness. He fell to his knees, unable to take another step. He looked at his hands, which no longer obeyed him, and cried. He cried for himself, for the strong, confident man he had been just a few hours ago. The shuffling stopped right behind his back. He felt the light touch of his own stolen glove on his shoulder. "Don't cry," whispered his own voice, but now it sounded pure and confident. "Soon you won't feel anything. It's liberation." And the darkness consumed David. Not the one around him, but the one that settled inside. The last thing he realized was that the old boots on his feet had finally stopped pressing. They fit perfectly.